My God, you are so beautiful. My God, you are so beautiful. My God, you are so beautiful.
Duke bought rejected bride with sack on her head, then he gasped when he saw her face with cowboy hat. The church bells tolled across grey London skies as Duke Sebastian Hale stood at the altar, spine rigid, thinking about land contracts instead of love. Around him, 200 guests craned their necks, whispering behind gloved hands about the unfortunate bride who would soon shuffle down the aisle on her stepmother's arm. Poor Duke, someone murmured. Marrying the Fairburn creature for those parcels of land. Sebastian's jaw tightened. He told himself duty mattered more than desire, that a duke's responsibilities outweighed personal preference. But when the church doors opened and his veiled bride began her slow approach, he steeled himself for disappointment and wondered if he just made the greatest mistake of his life. Hello, lovely. If you're enjoying this tale of hidden beauty and unexpected love, I'd be so grateful for a like or subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories where first impressions shatter and true character shines through. And if you'd like, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every note, and your presence makes these stories come alive. 1. Duke Sebastian Hale had perfected the art of duty over desire, and today's wedding was simply another obligation to fulfill. At 32, he'd inherited Weatherstone Hall young, along with debts from his late father's disastrous railway investment. The solution was practical: marry Miss Lila Fairburn, secure the adjoining lands tied to her mother's will, and stabilize his estate's finances. The fact that society whispered she was an ugly duckling barely registered. Sebastian had learned to ignore gossip years ago. But his younger sister Julia, seated in the front pew, hadn't developed such discipline. She leaned toward him during the processional music, her voice low but amused. At least she's quiet, they say. You won't have to endure endless chatter over breakfast. Julia, Sebastian warned. I'm simply preparing you for noble self-sacrifice, brother dear. Her eyes sparkled with mischief. Father always said a duke's duty comes before his happiness. Sebastian ignored her and focused on the approaching figure. Miss Lila Fairburn moved slowly down the aisle, her face hidden behind layers of heavy lace veil, her body obscured by a high-necked gown that seemed designed to conceal rather than flatter. Her stepmother, Mrs. Agnes Fairburn, gripped her arm with pinched fingers, her expression suggesting she was delivering a package rather than a daughter. The congregation whispered louder now. Sebastian caught fragments. Poor child, always so sickly. That limp. You know, from the fever. Agnes does her best, but you can't polish what isn't there. Sebastian had never actually seen Lila's face properly. At their one brief meeting to sign contracts, she'd been turned away, speaking in monosyllables while her stepmother dominated the conversation. Society painted her as unfortunate, sickly as a child, rarely seen in public, kept in dowdy gowns by her formidable stepmother. Rumors suggested scars, deformities, a permanent weakness that made her unsuitable for anyone but a desperate duke. He'd told himself it didn't matter. Looks faded. Land was permanent. But now, standing at the altar as she approached, Sebastian felt unexpected dread coil in his stomach. What exactly had he agreed to? Lila stopped beside him. Through the veil, he could see nothing. But he noticed her hands, steady, unshaking, folded calmly before her. Not the trembling hands of a terrified bride. The vicar began. Sebastian responded mechanically to his cues, his mind half on the ceremony and half on the accounts waiting in his study. Beside him, Lila's voice emerged clear and self-contained when she spoke her vows. I do. Not timid. Not weak. Just quietly certain. Sebastian frowned slightly. The voice didn't match the rumors. Nothing about her posture suggested the cowering creature society described. You may now unveil your bride, the vicar announced. This was it. The moment of truth. Sebastian reached for the lace with hands that felt suddenly clumsy. The congregation held its collective breath. He'd heard Lady Weatherby place a bet yesterday that the bride would have a face only a desperate duke could love. He lifted the veil and froze. The woman before him was not conventionally pretty in the porcelain doll style London favored, but she was striking. Big dark eyes met his with equal parts defense and amusement. Strong cheekbones gave her face character. Her mouth was expressive, currently pressed into a line that suggested she was trying not to laugh at his obvious shock. A faint pale scar traced near her temple, barely noticeable, adding rather than detracting from her unusual beauty. She was not ugly. Not even close. "I'm afraid the rumors oversold the tragedy, Your Grace," Lila said quietly, her voice dry enough to strike kindling. A tiny, shocked laugh rippled through the front pews. Sebastian heard Lady Weatherby gasp. Behind him, Julia made a strangled sound that might have been delight. Sebastian's mind reeled. He'd believed the gossip without question. He'd prepared himself for disappointment, for sacrifice, for duty unburdened by attraction. Instead, he stood facing a woman whose eyes danced with suppressed humor at his obvious confusion. He started, then stopped. What could he possibly say? Lila's mouth quirked slightly. "Shall we proceed, Your Grace? I believe there's a signature required." They signed the register in stunned silence. Sebastian's handwriting was barely legible. As they turned to walk back down the aisle as husband and wife, the congregation stared openly. No one had expected this. "She's not ugly at all," someone whispered loudly. "How disappointing." Agnes Fairburn lied to everyone. The Duke must be relieved. Sebastian's ears burned. He felt Lila's hand tighten almost imperceptibly on his arm, but her expression remained serene. She walked beside him with quiet dignity, neither rushing nor cowering. In the carriage afterward, silence stretched between them like uncharted territory. Sebastian sat across from his new wife, studying her openly now. In better light, she was even more arresting. The severe gown and pulled-back hair couldn't hide the grace in her movements or the intelligence in her eyes. He cleared his throat. The ceremony was efficient. Yes. Lila's gaze drifted to the window. "Efficiency seems to be our forte, Your Grace." "Sebastian," he corrected automatically. "We're married now." "Sebastian." She tested the name, then turned back to him with that same dry humor. Lady Weatherby looked ready to faint from shock when she saw I had an actual face. Sebastian fought a smile and lost. A small laugh escaped before he could stop it. "You heard that. I hear most things. People talk rather freely around the ugly duckling." She said it without bitterness, just observation. "They assume I'm deaf as well as unfortunate." The carriage rolled through London streets toward Weatherstone Hall. Sebastian found himself genuinely curious about this woman for the first time. "Why the heavy veil?" he asked. "If you're not, that is, if the rumors were exaggerated." Lila's expression shifted, became more guarded. "Because rumors are easier to control than reality. If people expected ugliness, they'd see ugliness no matter what I looked like. At least behind the veil, I could avoid being examined like a specimen." The insight struck him as surprisingly sophisticated. "And now I'm a duchess. The examination is mandatory." She met his eyes. "I hope I won't disappoint too terribly, Sebastian." "I don't think disappointment is the issue," he said carefully. "No." One eyebrow rose. "Then what is?" "I think I've been remarkably stupid." A genuine smile crossed her face, transforming it completely. "Well, at least you admit it. That's more than most men would do." The carriage pulled up to Weatherstone Hall. Servants lined the drive to greet their new duchess. Sebastian helped Lila down, acutely aware of how her hand felt in his, not delicate and breakable, but steady and real. As they climbed the steps together, Sebastian thought, "What exactly have I married?" But unlike this morning, the question no longer filled him with dread. Instead, he felt the first stirring of something dangerous. Curiosity. 2. In her new chambers that night, Lila Fairburn, no, Lila Hale now stood before the mirror and studied the woman reflected back. The same face she'd seen her entire life. Not beautiful by society's standards. Not ugly either. Just herself. She touched the faint scar near her temple, remembering. The fever had come when she was 14. 1 month of burning delirium, her mother's face hovering above her, cool cloths pressed to her forehead. When she'd finally woken, weak and hollow, her mother had been crying with relief. 2 weeks later, her mother was dead. Pneumonia, caught while nursing her daughter through the fever. Lila had always wondered if grief was just a fancy word for guilt. Her father, Lord Thomas Fairburn, remarried within a year. Agnes came with 2 daughters of her own, Marianne, who was pretty in a China doll way, and Elise, who had their mother's sharp features and sharper tongue. Lila, still recovering, became the inconvenient third daughter in a house that no longer felt like home. She remembered the day Agnes first called her unfortunate. Lila had been 15, still thin from the fever, her hair lank from months of illness. She'd walked into the drawing room during afternoon tea to find Agnes entertaining the neighbor, Mrs. Pemberton. Poor Lila, Agnes had said, not bothering to lower her voice. We do what we can, but you can't polish what isn't there. The fever left her so delicate. And that scar, of course. Such a shame. Mrs. Pemberton had made sympathetic noises. Lila had stood frozen in the doorway, feeling something inside her wither and die. From that day forward, Agnes crafted the ugly duckling story with careful precision. Outdated gowns that did Lila no favors. Hairstyles pulled severely back. Constant references to her delicate health that kept her home from balls and parties where she might have met other young people. Meanwhile, Marianne and Elise were dressed fashionably, paraded through society, praised constantly. At first, Lila had fought it. She tried to argue for better clothes, for the chance to attend gatherings. But her father, lost in his books and his grief, barely noticed. And Agnes simply smiled sweetly and said, "We must be realistic, dear. Not every girl is suited for society. You're much better suited to quiet pursuits." So Lila retreated. Into books. Into sketching. Into the quiet corners where no one paid attention. She developed a talent for observation, for seeing people when they thought themselves unseen. Her sketchbooks filled with caricatures, pompous neighbors, preening debutantes, Agnes's pinched expression when she thought no one was watching. She learned to be funny in private. To find humor in the absurdity of her situation. To hide novels inside embroidery frames and draw cartoons of the very people who pitied her. The ugly duckling reputation grew not because she was actually ugly, but because she was invisible. Badly dressed, kept in the background, never allowed to shine. People filled in the blanks with cruelty because that was easier than looking closely. When her father died 3 years ago, Agnes had been left with debts and 3 daughters to manage. She'd pushed Marianne and Elise aggressively toward any available bachelor, but matches proved elusive. The Fairburn fortune had evaporated with Lord Thomas's death. Lila had assumed she'd end up a governess eventually. Agnes certainly implied as much. Then came the letter from the Duke of Weatherstone. He needed to consolidate land. The Fairburn estate held several parcels that adjoined his property, parcels that had come through Lila's mother's will and were legally tied to Lila herself. A marriage would solve both problems, his need for land consolidation, their need for financial stability. Agnes had wanted to push Marianne forward. Surely the Duke would prefer my Marianne. She's so much more. But the solicitors had been clear. The land was Lila's. The marriage had to be Lila's. Agnes had framed it as charity. At least you'll be cared for, Lila. A duke won't mind what you look like if you come with acreage. It's more than you could have hoped for. Lila had accepted for 2 reasons. First, duty. Her father's debts would be settled. Second, escape. Weatherstone Hall would never be home, but it wouldn't be Agnes's house either. She'd chosen the heavy veil deliberately, not to hide ugliness, but to avoid being picked apart and whispered about as she walked up that aisle. Better to let them mock the idea of the ugly duckling than to give them her actual face to dissect. But then Sebastian had lifted the veil, and his shocked expression had been almost worth the years of humiliation. Almost. Now Lila studied herself in the mirror of her new chambers. Same face. Different future. The question was, would Sebastian be just another person who loved the idea of a noble sacrifice? Or could he see past the story society had written for her? She wouldn't know until she tested him. And she was very good at tests. Lila smiled at her reflection, a private smile that no one else would see. "Let's see what kind of man you really are, Your Grace," she whispered. Then she blew out her candle and climbed into the enormous Duchess's bed, alone on her wedding night, and surprisingly content with that fact. 3. Their wedding night proved to be more negotiation than romance. Sebastian arrived at Lila's chambers at a respectful hour, knocked, and entered when she called permission. She sat at her dressing table in a sensible nightgown, her hair braided over one shoulder, looking far less nervous than he felt. "I thought we should discuss expectations," Sebastian began awkwardly. "You mean whether we'll consummate the marriage tonight?" Lila's directness made him blink. "I appreciate the gentlemanly hesitation, Sebastian, but I'm not porcelain. I don't shatter. However, I would rather not endure anything simply because duty says so." Sebastian felt his tension crack. A surprised laugh escaped. "You're remarkably frank. I've spent years being talked around and over. I prefer clarity now." She turned to face him fully. "So, what do you actually want?" What did he want? Sebastian considered the question honestly. "I want a partnership. Not just heirs and duty. I'd like to know you beyond the rumors. And I'd like time to earn your trust before we—" He gestured vaguely. Relief flickered across Lila's face. "Then we're agreed. A truce. Partnership first. The heirs conversation can wait until there's actual trust between us." They shook hands solemnly, and Sebastian felt the first genuine warmth toward his new wife. The days at Weatherstone fell into unexpected patterns. Lila observed everything with those sharp eyes. Sebastian caught her examining the estate accounts one morning in his study. "Your tenant rents are structured inefficiently," she said without preamble. His spine stiffened. "I beg your pardon. 3 families are paying the same rate for vastly different acreage. You're losing income on the large parcels and overcharging the small ones." She pointed to specific entries. "If you adjusted based on actual land value and crop potential, you'd increase revenue by at least 15% while actually lowering costs for your poorest tenants." Sebastian stared at the numbers. She was right. He'd been so overwhelmed managing everything since his father's death that he'd never noticed. "I also think you should convert the unused east wing into a schoolroom," Lila continued, warming to her subject. "The village children have nowhere to learn. You're paying to maintain empty rooms. Why not use them?" "Because I never thought of it," Sebastian admitted. "Well." Lila smiled slightly. "Now you have." She was right about that too. Within a week, Sebastian found himself implementing her suggestions and wondering how he'd managed before she arrived. There were lighter moments that caught him off guard. Lila got lost in Weatherstone's maze-like corridors her 3rd day. A footman found her wandering near the servants' quarters, trying not to laugh at herself. "I've been here 3 days and I still can't find the library," she admitted when Sebastian encountered her. "This house is deliberately confusing. It was built by a duke who liked his privacy," Sebastian explained, amused despite himself. "Or who liked watching his guests wander helplessly." Lila's eyes sparkled. "I suspect he was related to the people who design London street maps." He caught himself smiling again. She had that effect. One night, Sebastian skipped a formal supper and snuck down to the kitchen for bread and cheese instead. He found Lila already there, wrapped in a shawl, cutting herself a thick slice of ham. They stared at each other. "I hate formal suppers," she said finally. 7 courses and everyone pretending the food matters when really they're just counting each other's jewelry. I was thinking the same thing, Sebastian admitted. They shared an impromptu meal at the kitchen table, talking about the absurdity of society expectations, and Sebastian realized he was genuinely enjoying his wife's company. The servants noticed too. Cook mentioned that the new Duchess always thanked everyone by name. The head gardener reported that she'd asked intelligent questions about crop rotation. The housekeeper said Lila never demanded, only requested, and always with a smile. When Lila walked through the village, children began trailing after her like ducklings. She'd started the joke herself, laughing when a little girl called her My Lady Duckling and turning it into a game. Now the village children competed to be her duckling train when she made her rounds. Sebastian watched from a distance one afternoon as his wife, surrounded by giggling children, helped a boy fly a kite. Her laughter carried across the green, genuine and unguarded. He was beginning to understand that he'd married someone remarkable. But London was another matter. The gossip columns discovered their marriage with glee. The Duckling Duchess, one paper crowned her. Another speculated crudely about whether the Duke's sacrifice had been worth the land. The caricatures were worse, Lila drawn as an actual duck wearing a coronet, Sebastian looking nobly martyred beside her. Sebastian read the papers in his study, fury building. But he did nothing public. He was used to ignoring the press. Surely Lila would understand that engaging only made things worse. She laughed it off when he mentioned the nickname. Better a duckling than forgotten entirely, she said lightly. But Sebastian saw the flash of hurt in her eyes before she hid it. The real blow came at a small dinner party with Sebastian's old Cambridge friends. Lord Henry Blackwood, deep in his cups, raised a toast to love outshining looks. He winked at Sebastian as the table chuckled knowingly. Sebastian's jaw tightened. He knew he should say something, should shut down the implication. But the words stuck in his throat, paralyzed by years of avoiding confrontation. He stayed silent. Lila smiled politely, raising her own glass. Her expression never changed. But her hand trembled slightly when she set down the glass, and she excused herself early, claiming a headache. That night, Sebastian passed her chamber and saw through the half-open door that she sat at her desk, sketching. He glimpsed the drawing, a caricature of herself as a duck in a tiara, the humor in the lines unable to hide the hurt underneath. Shame hit him like a fist to the gut. She'd defended herself at their wedding by refusing to be what people expected. But he'd just let his friends mock her openly. And his silence had counted as agreement. Sebastian stood in the corridor, staring at that sketch, and realized he was failing her. The question was, what would he do about it? 4. Sebastian decided to force the issue by hosting a house party at Weatherstone. If he was going to publicly claim his wife, he needed to do it before people who mattered. Before society. The invitations went out to key families, including several he'd been avoiding since the wedding. It was time to reshape the narrative, to make clear that Lila was not a sacrifice but a choice. He didn't tell her his full reasoning. Just said it would be good for the estate's social standing. Lila agreed with the careful neutrality she'd adopted lately around him. Among the guests was Lady Aurelia Wentworth, beautiful in the classic style London worshipped, golden curls, perfect features, impeccable breeding. Sebastian had courted her briefly years ago before realizing she despised everything about his actual life. She hated the factories, hated the tenants, hated his interest in modern farming techniques. She'd wanted a decorative duke, not a working one. He'd ended things and never looked back. But Aurelia had clearly expected to be Duchess eventually. Her presence at the house party hummed with barely suppressed fury. The first night, at dinner, Aurelia smiled sweetly at Lila. How brave of you to appear in daylight, my dear. We had all prepared ourselves for something much worse, you know. The table went silent. Lila set down her fork carefully. Yes, rumors do tend to be disappointing when compared to reality. I've found the same about people who spread them. A few guests choked on their wine. Sebastian fought a smile. Aurelia's eyes narrowed, but she continued sweetly throughout the week. Little comments. Such unusual fashion, Lila dear. I'm sure you'll grow into the role eventually. Sebastian must be so relieved you're not actually hideous. Each barb landed precisely. And each time, Lila responded with increasingly sharp wit that made Sebastian want to applaud even as he wondered why he wasn't stepping in himself. The breaking point came on the fourth evening. Sebastian was in his study reviewing accounts when he heard voices drifting from the morning room, female voices, speaking quietly but clearly through the half-open door. I heard from Lady Morrison that the Duke intends to set Lila aside once the estates are fully consolidated, Aurelia was saying. The marriage was only ever a business arrangement. Once he's secured the land transfers, he'll establish her in a separate household and marry properly. But they seem quite cordial, another voice objected. Cordiality isn't love, darling. Sebastian married her for practicality. No one expects him to actually care for the poor creature. Once he's done his duty and produced an heir, he'll return to London and find more suitable companionship. Sebastian's hands clenched on the papers. The rumor was completely false. But before he could move, he heard Lila's voice. How fascinating. Do go on. He reached the doorway in time to see Lila standing in the morning room entrance, her face pale but composed. Three ladies clustered around Aurelia looked horrified at being overheard. Aurelia herself showed only a moment's guilt before her expression smoothed into false concern. Oh, Lila, I was just gossiping about my marriage. Lila finished. Yes, I gathered that. Please don't let me interrupt. I'm quite curious to hear what other plans my husband has made without bothering to inform me. We were simply discussing what everyone knows, Aurelia said coolly. You married for land. Sebastian married for consolidation. It's a business arrangement. There's no shame in acknowledging the truth. The truth. Lila's voice went very quiet. The truth is that you wanted to be Duchess, failed, and now you're trying to convince yourself my marriage is as hollow as yours would have been. Aurelia's face flushed red. How dare you? How dare I speak plainly? Lila's eyes blazed now. You've spent a week needling me with polite cruelty, Lady Aurelia. Forgive me if I've lost patience with pretense. She turned and walked out, her spine straight, her hands trembling. Sebastian stood frozen in the doorway as the ladies scattered like guilty children. Aurelia swept past him without meeting his eyes. He found Lila in the garden, pacing among the roses, her composure finally cracking. I won't be humiliated twice in one life, she said before he could speak. Once by Agnes, and now by your former lover spreading rumors that you're ashamed of me. I'm not. Aren't you? She whirled to face him. You've let every joke stand unchallenged, Sebastian. Every time someone implied I was a sacrifice, every time they called me the Duckling Duchess, you stayed silent. You may not have started the story, but you certainly let them write me as a joke. The accusation hit home because it was true. I thought ignoring them was kinder, Sebastian said weakly. Kinder to whom? Lila's voice cracked. To me, who has to sit there pretending it doesn't hurt? Or to you, who doesn't have to risk confrontation? Silence fell between them like a chasm. I believed the rumors, Sebastian admitted finally. Before the wedding. I believed you'd be unfortunate, plain, weak. I married you for the land, and I told myself your appearance didn't matter because I was being noble. He forced himself to meet her eyes. That was my arrogance. And I've been too cowardly to admit how wrong I was. And now? Lila whispered. What am I to you now? Now you're the person I think about first thing each morning. The mind that shames my own. The woman whose courage humbles me. His voice roughened. I don't know how to show you that without feeling like a hypocrite. Lila's eyes filled with tears. I leaned into the ugly duckling myth because it felt safer to be underestimated than to risk being seen and rejected again. I was a coward too, Sebastian. We both hid behind that story. They stood in the rose garden as the truth settled between them, painful and necessary. That evening, Aurelia orchestrated her final cruelty. She'd arranged a game in the main salon, blindfolded gentlemen guessing ladies by touch and scent. Ostensibly charming. Actually designed to humiliate Lila by making her the punchline when no one could identify her by anything but process of elimination. Lila walked into the salon to find the game in progress, heard Aurelia announce it as the only fair way for our poor duckling duchess to stand a chance. Before Aurelia could pull Lila into the circle, Sebastian stepped forward. His voice cut through the laughter like ice. I believe the game is finished. The room went silent. What we have here, Sebastian continued, his gaze fixed on Aurelia, is not a game but childish cruelty. And I'm done pretending otherwise. He crossed to Lila and took her hand deliberately, publicly. I need to tell you all something, he said, his voice carrying to every corner. I married Lila Fairburn for land and money. That's true. But what I found was a woman whose mind shames my own and whose courage humbles me. He squeezed Lila's hand. I thought I was marrying an ugly duckling. That was my arrogance talking, my willingness to believe gossip without question. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. What I unveiled that day, Sebastian continued, his eyes on Lila now, was the only person in this room with the grace to laugh at herself while the rest of us scrambled to feel superior. He turned back to the gathered guests. If anyone in my presence calls my wife a duckling again, I shall assume they mean swan and treat them accordingly. Are we clear? Stunned silence. Then slowly, genuine applause from several quarters. Old Lord Whitmore raised his glass in approval. Lady Morrison smiled warmly at Lila. Even the young people looked impressed. Aurelia stood exposed, petty, cruel, and ridiculous. She left the next morning without saying goodbye. That night, alone in Lila's sitting room, they finally had the honest conversation they'd been avoiding. Thank you, Lila whispered. For claiming me. For seeing me. Thank you for being brave enough to let me see you. Sebastian touched her face gently. I'm in love with you, Lila. Not grateful. Not dutiful. In love. She kissed him then, fierce and certain. Good. Because I'm in love with you too, and I was getting tired of waiting for you to realize it. They chose each other fully that night, emotionally and physically, no more masks, no more half-truths. Just two people who'd started with duty and built something true. 5. 6 months later, Weatherstone Hall had transformed. Lila walked through rooms that now stayed open to sunlight, past servants who smiled freely, through corridors lined with children's drawings from the village school she'd established. The Duckling Society, she called it, a small academy for girls deemed too clever, too plain, or too awkward for traditional society. She taught them to read, to sketch, to think for themselves. And she told them the truth, that the world would always talk, and their job was to give it something worth talking about. On this particular morning, she found Sebastian in the garden, attempting to set up a picnic. The basket was chaos, random bread, too much cheese, a bottle of wine but no glasses. He looked up as she approached, sheepish. I wanted to surprise you. Lila looked at the disaster and started laughing. She laughed until tears streamed down her face, until her sides hurt, until Sebastian was laughing too. It's terrible, she gasped. Completely terrible, he agreed. She kissed him anyway, tasting wine and cheese and joy. Thank you for trying. They'd attended a London ball the previous week. Lila had worn a deep blue gown she'd chosen herself, simple but bold, making her dark eyes striking. No one would dare call her ugly now, but more importantly, she no longer cared if they did. She'd noticed a young woman hovering near a pillar during the dancing, trying to disappear the way Lila once had. Instead of ignoring her, Lila had approached, started an easy conversation, gently drawn her into a group. Sebastian had watched from across the room, pride and love written all over his face. Now, in the garden, they sat among the picnic ruins and talked about everything and nothing. The new tenant contracts. Julia's latest letter. Whether to expand the school to include boys. A newspaper called the Duckling Society charmingly eccentric, Lila mentioned. I think that's London's way of admitting we might be onto something. I found the article, Sebastian said. I thought we should frame it for the schoolroom. Proof that even London eventually catches up. She smiled at him, this man who'd thought he was marrying a duty and instead found a partner. That evening, riding back from the village in their carriage, Lila leaned against Sebastian's shoulder, tired but content. Lady Thornton made another comment about ducklings today, she said idly. What did you say? I thanked her for noticing that ducklings grow into swans. Lila smiled. She looked quite confused. Sebastian chuckled, pressing a kiss to her hair. Thank you. For what? For transforming my house. My life. For being brave enough to show me who you really were. Lila turned to look up at him, her eyes soft. I didn't unveil myself, Sebastian. You finally learned how to see me. Perhaps we both learned to see clearly. He kissed her properly then, slow and sweet. No more veils. No more hiding. No more veils, she agreed. The carriage rolled through the twilight toward home, carrying a duke and duchess who'd started with deception and found truth. Who'd been called ugly duckling and noble sacrifice, but who'd built something far more valuable than appearance or duty. They'd built love. And that, as it turned out, was the most beautiful thing of all. Dear listeners, Sebastian and Lila proved that first impressions can blind us to truth, that cruelty often says more about the speaker than the subject, and that real beauty lives in courage, intelligence, and the willingness to be vulnerable. If this story touched your heart, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing for more tales where hidden depths are revealed and true love sees past society's shallow judgments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been underestimated because of others' assumptions?